Do you ever feel like Dungeons and Dragons rules leave gaps? Things like reputation, corruption, ship combat, or faction play? Well, TSR actually built mechanics for all of these, but not for D&D. They hid them in other RPGs that you've probably never played or maybe even heard of. I'm going to crack open the vault to see what we've lost and what we might be able to bring back today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is going to be part of a new series that I'm doing about other games created by Dungeons & Dragons' original publisher, Tactical Studies Rules, and, of course, TSR. So I have made videos about these before, but I've just kind of buried them into my overall playlist on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, and specifically the history of Dungeons & Dragons. And so I'm going to add them to this new playlist on other historical role-playing games, again, by TSR specifically. So in the past, I've talked about games like Gamma World. I've talked about Empire of the Petal Throne. I talked about Boot Hill. I talked about Top Secret, spy type of adventures, spy genre. I've talked about these space science fiction, space opera kind of adventures that you can have with Star Frontiers. And then also superhero action from the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game from 1984. So I do have, again, dedicated videos on all of those games. So today I'm going to be talking about 5 games. I know it sounds like a lot, but I'm not going to do like a deep dive in each game. What I'm looking for is to kind of just understand what was happening at TSR. These are going to cover basically the entire decade of the 80s. So going from roughly 1982 through 1988, and talking about these 5 games that came out during this time period and what it said about the company, what it said about the health of Dungeons and Dragons and other things, and also just the design philosophies and how they're going to change over the course of those few years in the 80s. And so we can get a sense of what was happening in the larger tabletop role-playing game industry in general, and how those other games by other companies were affecting the design philosophies and mechanics that were being implemented in some of these games at TSR. So very specifically, what I'm going to be talking about today is Dawn Patrol, 1982. And this originally came out, it predates the foundation of TSR and of Dungeons & Dragons. It's originally called Fight in the Skies by Mike Carr. We're going to get all into that when we get into this game. But this is from 1982. And then we're going to talk about another game released in 1982, which is Gangbusters. So that is a game of, 1920s sort of cops and robbers style prohibition era action. And 1982 is a very, very important year for TSR. So not only do you have these 2 games, Dawn Patrol and Gangbusters, but 1982 is also the same year that Star Frontiers was released, as I mentioned earlier. And it's also a pretty important year for TSR because it's going to be the first year since 1977 that TSR does not publish a hardback book for the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line. So instead of going back and publishing more advanced D&D material that they'd seen, with a dedicated hardback per year from 77 through 81. Instead, they are expanding into, all these other different genres of games, 1920s crime and science fiction, and then World War I aerial combat. So it sounds like that, when you look at it from a historical standpoint, it's kind of the implication is that they were trying things out. They were trying to do something different and not necessarily just stick with the big money maker, which of course was going to be D&D and advanced D&D. So I did do a video in the past where I talked a little bit about all of the different box sets that TSR produced. So not just role-playing games, but also box set expansions like campaign settings and things like that. There were a total of, I think, 35 of them. And so some of these games I'm going to talk about today, I already discussed very briefly in that particular video. But it was basically just saying that they came out and maybe a little bit about the creators. And so because I did talk about the creators in that video, I'm not going to delve into them as much here, except, just a few acknowledgments. But in addition to Gangbusters and Dawn Patrol, we're also going to go over 1984's Indiana Jones role-playing game, and then 1985's Conan role-playing games. So these are games that based on licenses very similar to the 1984 license that TSR picked up for Marvel superheroes. And so we're going to talk about that. And then the last game, we're going to skip ahead to 1988 and talk about the Buck Rogers 25th Century role-playing game. So that will wrap up the discussion. But what I'm going to talk about for each one of these games is sort of the mechanics, things about like attributes, how character creation worked. I'm going to talk a little bit about combat. And, for each game, there'll be some specific other things that I pull out to talk about how it kind of helped evoke the genre that the game was trying to do based on, its topic. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes each game unique. And along the way, I will be from time to time comparing certain mechanics to ones from D&D. And then at the end section for each of these games, I'm going to talk about specific takeaways that you can put into your D&D games. You can take these mechanics that were designed for another game and be inspired by them to use them in an old school style, OSR or whatever you want to call it, D&D style game. And that's going to be like I think the really fun part is finding those little nuggets of information. So that is going to be the structure of this particular video. And so if learning about those other types of mechanics that might be useful in a D&D game and being inspired by things that come from these other types of games are interesting to you, or maybe if you just enjoy the history of learning that these other games even existed and what they were and how they worked, then please take a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and adjust the settings on the bell icon so that you'll be notified when I upload new videos like this one. All right, now with that, I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in and talk about Dawn Patrol first. Okay, now let's look at the first game that we're going to be talking about today, which is Dawn Patrol from 1982. Kind of. Dawn Patrol actually started out as a game in 1966, I believe it was, originally published, called Fight in the Skies by Mike Carr. And so I talked about this just recently in another video. And Mike is, from a D&D standpoint, probably most famous for writing B1, Adventure B1, and Search of the Unknown. He's also the editor on a lot of the AD&D hardbacks. Like there's a section by him in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide from 1979. And so I think this is a really interesting example of a game because it so for one thing, being created in 1966, it predates stuff like Blackmore that we've talked about before here on the channel. And Mike Carr was part of the Blackmore bunch. He played with that group. But it is a tactical aerial combat war game that incorporated role-playing game aspects. And it is one of the first games to really do that. So it's very much part of this tradition of figuring out how to transition from a tactical board game into a role-playing game. And this combines elements of both. And I think it's a really fascinating example of this sort of transitional period of when these things were becoming more and more popular. So now this is going to be the only game that we talk about today where I actually own a physical copy of the game. And so the other ones we're going to go over on PDF. But the reason that I have this game, actually, this is not one I've had since I was a kid. I was aware of this game. It was always on my list of something to pick up. I saw it advertised in catalogs, like the Gateway to Adventure catalog. I just never picked it up. And I got it actually just a couple years ago at DaveCon in April of 2024. I attended, and there was a convention attendee there who was looking to kind of get rid of some of his stuff. He didn't need it anymore. I was looking to make a little bit of money. And he had this game, and he sold it to me. Which was really cool. It's in pretty good shape. The box is a little dinged up. Some of the counters have been punched. But overall, it was in good shape. And the really cool thing for me was that I was able to get it signed by Mike Carr, who was there and is the creator of this game. So I talked with him and asked him if he would sign my game. And he said yes. So talk about that a little bit more in a second. But here's the back of the box. So you can see all the things that were included. Let's go ahead and just open it up and look what's in here. Now, this sheet at the top, I do not believe is part of the original set, but Mike had these that he created. And it's basically a beginner's guide to playing. I don't know why that is not at focus. There we go. Beginner's Guide to Playing the Dawn Patrol game. So he had these because Mike ran a Dawn Patrol game at DaveCon. And I unfortunately didn't get to play in it because I was at the same time playing in a Blackmore style game run by Bill Hoyt, one of the original Blackmore players in Dave Arneson's game. And so I had signed up for that. And so Professor Dungeon Master from Dungeon Craft and Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian, they signed up for Mike Carr's Dawn Patrol game. And they were like right outside the room where I was. Like I could see them through the door. It was really funny. But I went up afterwards and Mike had extras of these sheets. And I asked him if I could have one since I had just purchased this game. So this is not an original part. Now you see it comes with dice. They have 2d6 here. This is a 2d6 system. So it is the only game that we're going to be talking about here today that is not a it's the only one that is a 2d6 system. I'll just put it that way. Okay, so now as far as the mechanics in this game, basically this is a World War I aerial combat game that takes place on a map. Okay, so you've got your map in here. Let's go ahead and pull that out so we can see what we're looking at. It's not going to fit on the camera, but we can at least get an idea of what's in here. I'll go through some of these other things later. But so here's the map, and it's based on moving across these squares. Okay, I might have said hex earlier. It's squares, and altitude is being tracked separately. So the squares are going to be for movement, like on a flat plane, and then you're going to track your altitude via your logbook or counters or something else. So movement and firing is done by doing simultaneous and secret declarations. So you're secretly going to write down your movement and what you're going to do, and then you're going to reveal at the same time. So, and then that's converted into a resolution at the end of the turn. So the rules are very, very war game style, but then TSR includes later on this little 4-page supplement. So this was not part of the original rules, this role-playing game aspects. And that's why on the cover here, you see it says that it says role-playing game of World War I aerial combat. Fight in the Skies did not say that because Fight in the Skies was not a role-playing game. At least, people didn't use that term back then. I've talked about this before. That was a new term. But role-playing games by this point, 1982, have become super popular, and TSR is really trying to capture this marketplace. So they're going to call this a role-playing game and include this little extra bit of goodies. People, when they played Fight in the Skies, there were role-playing game aspects to it. They just weren't necessarily called out in the rules. It's just how people played the game. Very similarly to how people like in some early war games that Dave Arneson's group and stuff were playing, there weren't necessarily role-playing aspects called out in the rules, but the players started playing them that way, and those role-playing game aspects kind of start coming into fruition. Okay, so as far as character creation in this game and advancement, you're playing pilots. Okay, so you're playing a pilot, and you have a pilot logbook to track the aircraft that you've flown, the kills you have, the promotions, the ace status, all that kind of stuff is talked about here at the end of the book. You've got here in an appendix your aircraft mission log. Okay, and the campaign rules allow for your pilots to kind of gain reputation, gain medals, gain promotions, move up as far as like your title. So that's in the supplemental, role-playing aspects section where it talks about your starting rank and your flying ranks by country. So you can kind of move up that way. That's a sense of like your character advancement. So you can do that and get promoted across, several missions by keeping that log. But really the core of the game, it's a tactical war game with sort of these optional RPG elements tacked on at the end, provided here in this section. So it's this unique hybrid of game. It's a very highly tactical war game with role-playing game aspects kind of added later, but it's going to be the most war game-like of all the games that we're going to talk about here today. So we talked about the combat mechanics as far as sort of like the secret simultaneous movement declarations and things like that. Okay, so you've got altitude and positioning, determining your firing arcs, your weapon resolutions handled with dice and tables, and maneuvering to a firing position and altitude advantage are central to this game. So aircraft have stats like speed, climb, dive, turn capability, all of that. Now, a lot of these cards and things that you see in here are sort of like summarizing all of those so that you have it all readily available. Rather than having to get out the rule book. Okay, so what's really interesting in here is that Mike Carr is a very, very big on the history of games. He's much more of a fan of war games. This is what he told me, okay, when I interviewed him when I went to that convention. So he was much more a fan of these like military or historical war games, more so than role-playing. He did the role-playing with Blackmore and that kind of stuff, but he much preferred these sort of military type of games. And so he did a ton of research in here to figure out like all the stats for all these different planes and stuff. And like in the end here, he's got this section on historical commentary. And you see he writes all about in here about what was going on at the time. But like his research on the planes that they had was very, very specific. And what's really fun about this game is that it takes place during World War I, so you can play over the course of about 4 years worth of time, 1914 through 1918. However, although there's all these different planes explained in here, in the game, you can only use planes from the chosen year that you're going to play, as an example. So if you decide to play in 1914, you can't use a plane in that campaign that wasn't available until 1918. You have to use what was available in 1914. And that level of like specificity and historical accuracy, I think, is very unique to this particular game. So it's very famous for its simplicity and its longevity. So this game has the distinction of being the unique distinction of being the only game that's been played at every single Gen Con since Gen Con was founded. So no other game can say that. This is the only one. So I know in the past, Mike Carr actually used to run the games of Dawn Patrol or Fight in the Skies, whatever you want to call it, at Gen Con. I don't know if he still does them. Obviously, he just ran that one at Dave Con, like I mentioned. And recently in the comments, and actually, let's point it out here. Well, I guess it's not listed in here, but John Pickens wrote in the comments on one of my other videos and mentioned how he is friends with Mike Carr and he plays in Fight in the Skies every year. I think it's GaryCon. So I'm guessing Mike runs that game there as well at GaryCon. So those are fun conventions if you guys ever get a chance to go, because you'll be able to meet some of these original creators of these games or original players and actually be sitting in a game that run by the people that created the game in the first place, right? So definitely try to check those out. But also, I just wanted to point out, like, John Pickens is another early TSR hire, and I've mentioned him before, but he tends to comment on my videos when he has time or if it's a topic that interests him. And he just wrote a very long, interesting, detailed comment on my cleric video where I talked about the history of the cleric class throughout the D&D editions. And he said he enjoyed the video. He had a couple of minor quibbles of things where he disagreed with some of the my thought process or the conclusions that I'd come to based on certain things, and that's totally fine. A couple times he corrected me right out, which he should have done, and I made a few mistakes. Very specifically, a bunch of people caught this. I confused the difference between wands, rods, and staves as far as like which one was more available to more different types of character classes, and I said it was wands, and that was incorrect. But my whole point in saying that was that certain ones of those could be used by a smaller group of character classes. So I believe wands are restricted to only the magic using classes, like specifically like arcane magic, what we would call now like magic users. They use different saving throw tables versus the other two, rods and staves, because those have a wider application of people who might be using them, right? And that was the whole point. So I got the details incorrect of like who could use which, but he called me out on it in a nice way, and so I appreciated that. But you'll definitely want to be checking the comments from time to time on these historical videos, because you will see some of the original creators. Chris Holmes, who is Professor Holmes' son of the Holmes edition, he comments all the time on my videos and adds color commentary, historical commentary from things that he remembers talking about with his dad, which I think is really, really cool. And so that's just two of the creators that have been in the comments. But Um, I wanted to point that out because John Pickens says he plays Fight in the Skies every year, and it just has this long history that I think is really, really fascinating. So also the other kind of some interesting things here are really just looking at how TSR was handling this idea of adding these role-playing aspects to this game that didn't originally have them. And so it's talking about like pilot rosters, and developing the personalities of individual pilots and keeping track of their piloting career. Okay, and then you've got your pilots and your aircraft, your missions, kills, and plot experience. Now, these are all things that you're going to put into your mission logs. Got your rank and promotion, we talked about that. But the mission logs are talked about here in the original book. And so those mission logs, even without these additional little commentary here from this little 4-page supplement, well, the mission log is really giving you a sense of role playing, because you're playing the same pilot, and if your pilot survives the mission, you get to go on another mission, but it's the same guy, right? So it has more of a personality than like original war games where that was sort of really irrelevant. Okay, so it's unique, I think, because it's one of the earliest and the most enduring flight combat games just in general, and it marries tactical movement with campaign continuity. So the pilot logs, the narrative continuity, that kind of thing. It makes this game really, really unique, as well as just its enduring history. The Fight in the Skies Society, people still creating content, having been played at Gen Con every year, you can find people there who have pilot logs going back decades, like players that have these for their pilots that go back through decades of like real world time of having played this game at Gen Con over the years. And I think that's amazing. It's a piece of history that I think is amazing that we still have, but this is a living game. People still play the game. It's not like the game has gone away and people are talking about the good old times. It's like people are still interested in it. And I really think that's fascinating. So, if you're trying to compare this to something like D&D, that's very, very different, right? So the focus of Dawn Patrol is on vehicle, craft, tactical maneuvers. It's a tactical war game. D&D is really kind of focused on a personal adventure or party kind of tactical combat and more role playing. The movement is grid based and altitude. There's simultaneous but secret movement in Dawn Patrol, but D&D has like that very much like I go, you go initiative type of combat. So the secret declarations in Dawn Patrol, I think, are really, really fun. And then it has like the continuity comes from the pilot log books and the campaigns in Dawn Patrol, whereas in D&D, it's like, it's XP and levels that you're gaining across sessions, right? So what are some ideas that we can take from Dawn Patrol to use in a D&D game? And I think, well, the first one, of course, is going to be these adventure log books. It's using it as an example of how to track your sessions in a D&D game, but it's giving you like a format like that you can use. And as a DM, you can create a format like this to kind of help players track this kind of stuff during their games so that they can track, where they were, what the date was, who did they meet, who did they, if they killed somebody or like whatever it is, to that kind of thing. And you can, as a reward for them writing this down and keeping these logs, which is going to help you as a DM too, right? How many DMs have said like, hey, do you guys remember what you did last session? If you go way too long between sessions, like I tend to do with my games. And if I don't write it down right away, sometimes I forget, but I have one player in my daughter's game. She is very diligent about taking notes. And so I always know I can count on her. Like I'll email her before, like a few weeks before our next session. I'll say like, hey, can you send me your notes? Like just take a photo with your phone. And because I just need to refresh my memory of what was happening. But you can give them like a little bit of mechanical benefit. Maybe it's like a +1 to their reaction roll in towns where people know of their exploits because of all the missions that they've accomplished. If you track things like missions. Okay, but you can also use the idea of the secret simultaneous movement when you're having vehicle combat. Like even if it's naval based, like ship based combat, but if you've got like airships in your D&D games or spelljammers and stuff like that, I kind of like the idea of having people. It's very battleship like, right? Sort of writing your moves down in secret, like where are you going to move, and then revealing at the same time to see where you are. I think it just kind of adds a little bit of tension to the game that is really sort of fun. And you can use, adding the attributes for the planes that you see in here. You can take that as an example of things that you might want to look at for vehicles in a D&D type game. So, their maneuver or their turn radius, their speed, that kind of thing. And it kind of helps to resolve like these cinematic tactical dogfights in a D&D game with D&D type of vehicles. Okay. And then you can also do campaign like linked plots, right? So let crews accrue their promotions over time or medals that give them maybe mechanical benefits, again, reaction roll bonuses and things like that for people that gain medals for their missions. So if you treat it very kind of a military type aspect, you can think of how to employ those types of situations into a standard D&D game. So, that's just scratching the surface. Again, the intent here is not to cover how to play Dawn Patrol or go through page by page and go through the mechanics. It's just to kind of give you a flavor of how these kinds of games can be played and to see if there's any inspiration that we can take out of here and pull into a D&D game. So, but if you want like a deeper dive or like a whole video dedicated to say just Dawn Patrol, put that in the comments below and let me know. I just wasn't sure how much interest there was going to be in that. So, I kind of covered like what I thought at the time were the games, that people might have been more interested in, like Gamma World or, Top Secret or Marvel Superheroes, that kind of thing. But again, these other games, they're a fascinating peek into TSR history. So if you do want a full or deep dive video, definitely let me know. And I can definitely add that to the list of potential future videos. But that's going to be our look at Dawn Patrol from 1966 to 1982. If you would like to support Daddy Rolled a One, there are now 4 ways to do so. The first is that you can become a patron. Just go to patreon.com/DaddyRolledA1 and sign up to receive exclusive monthly content, including system-neutral random tables, bonus videos for content that didn't make it to YouTube, eventually a Discord server for Daddy Rolled a One patrons, and one of the coolest features, I think, which are short mini old school adventures with artwork and maps that are only available to my patrons. These aren't reused maps that you can find online. They are only available to my patrons. So again, it's patreon.com/DaddyRolledA1 or see the link in the show notes. You can also become a super fan. Just hit that heart icon with the little $sign in it as a way to contribute financially to the channel, to show your support for all of the time that goes into researching and recording and editing these videos so that you can enjoy them each week. And you'll join this list of other fine folks who have been able to do so. And I really, really appreciate the support of folks who are able to do that. You can also buy merchandise from my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, or tote bag from Spreadshop, or you can buy paper goods like a sticker, poster, or notebook from my Redbubble shop. These are exclusive designs. They're only available from Daddy Rolled a One. And the notebooks in particular at Redbubble have been pretty popular since I added those. You can get either a spiral bound or a hardbound notebook with paper of blank, lined, or graph paper if you want to use that to like draw a dungeon. So you'll find all of those at the show notes below. Then the last thing you can do to support the channel is by buying my supplement, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. This is available at DriveThruRPG. I kickstarted it last summer. It is a 48-page supplement that includes ideas for making expert type characters like in a specific area. And then it has all these different random tables to help make those different experts come alive. It's got 3 new character classes. It has an alchemist, a demolitionist, and an inventor. It's got pages and pages of new equipment. It has a 3-story guild hall with secrets, NPCs, rumors, adventure hooks, and it has advice on running expert-themed campaigns and a list of inspirational media to kind of help get you in the mood for using expert-style characters in classic old-school fantasy class and level games. So it's available as a softcover POD or as a PDF, and with that parchment-style paper that you see here, or if it's easier on the eyes, pick up the plain white background. So all that available at DriveThruRPG. Again, links are in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support of Daddy Rolled a One. All right, so let's continue our discussion with the other game released in 1982. This is Gangbusters, the 1920s role-playing adventure game. Now, this game originally came out as a boxed set, like I said, in 1982, and it included rules and adventure, maps, counters, dice, all the things that you would expect from a box set role-playing game back then. However, that game is not available anywhere to like buy as a even as a PDF. So there's a long history behind this, but one of the two creators of the game, Rick Krebs, he has assigned the rights to another individual. I want to say his name's Mark Hunt. And Mark has actually developed a version of Gangbusters. He's published material that work with the original Gangbusters rules as like adventures and things like that. But Mark has also created a version of Gangbusters that he calls Gangbusters BX, I believe it is. And it is sort of, evoking the Gangbusters game system, but using the 1981 BX D&D rules engine. So again, if you're familiar with old school Essentials, that retro clone, that's the same game. And so you might want to check that out because that is available. You can just go buy that. But what I'm going to be looking at here is a one book version that took everything that was in the box set and added in material from, I think it was the first adventure that gets into faction play. And that was released in 1990, I think it was. And it says new third edition, which is hilarious because it was actually the second edition. So somehow multiple layers of bureaucracy at TSR looked at this cover that said new third edition, and no one caught it and remembered that they'd only released one edition before. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. But my understanding is, and I have never seen the original box set of Gangbusters, but my understanding from the research I've done is that the rules in here in this box or in this book, the so-called third edition, are the same as what we saw in the original game. Okay, so again, it's going to be designed by Mark Krebs with, Mark Akers with Rick Krebs. So, and I talked about them before when I talked about Gangbusters briefly in that other video, so I'm not going to go too much more into their history. But also additional development by Tom Moldvay, which I think is cool. And then you'll see there down on the original editing, John Pickens is listed there. And very specific, says original editing. So the second edition editing is done by Steve Shend, I think it is. I can't quite make that out. And then able assistance by John Pickens. So hopefully John sees this and knows again how much I appreciate all of the work and the ideas that he contributed to my youth as someone who just loves role-playing games. But in any event, the cover art here is done by Jim Holloway, and I talked about him recently in another video. And then the interior art for this version is going to be done by Jeff Easley, Jim Holloway, and Harry Quinn. Again, I've talked about all of them before. Now, the one thing I will say is my understanding, again, not having seen the original box set, is that I believe in the original set, all of the art, the cover and the interior was just by Jim Holloway. Like those other folks weren't involved. However, I can't confirm that because again, I haven't seen that. So this game is set in a fictional Chicago analog called Lakefront City. And so they use the fictional city because then they're able to basically not be beholden to things that happen historically. They can make things up as to what happened. And so I think it makes sense. I know a lot of people wish that they had used real cities, but I think for a game like this, where, you might do something that could impact what happened historically, it's just make up a fictional city and then you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. And, fiction's full of fictional city, Gotham City and Metropolis and all that kind of stuff. So I think that that's fine. And the game really emphasizes things like political corruption and violent crime and the rise of organized syndicates. And it's a very sandbox style game, very sandbox style. And it's a great example of kind of if you're not used to sandbox style play, if you're used to pre-scripted adventures and things like that, Gangbusters is a really great game to kind of look to for examples on how to run a sandbox style game. Regardless of the fact of what the setting is, you can apply these principles to any setting that you want. But players are they can build, start small and they can end up building criminal empires, or they can dismantle a said criminal empire from like the inside. They can infiltrate, do all these types of things. And so it's very much like emergent story and gameplay that comes from player actions. So the mechanics in this, it's pretty simple. It is a percentile based system, and it has different attributes. There's going to be muscle, agility, accuracy, charm, luck, and mental endurance. So nothing that like is going to jump out at you, but it's a different list of attributes than what we're used to. Okay, but there's another extra step in here that's called presence. And this is a pretty big deal in this game, and it's really, really fun. It's kind of taking the charisma bonus to a reaction roll table and like dialing it up to 12. It's a really kind of fun idea. But to get your player's presence, you roll a d10, and then you look at this table here to see what your modifier is going to be. So on a 1 to 3, your modifier is +2, and on a 4 to 7, it's +1. And then you add that modifier to certain rolls that you're making in the game. Based on your influence, your reputation, that kind of thing. So it's a really kind of fun mechanic. And we'll come back to that toward the end of the discussion here. It has careers instead of classes. It's kind of in the same vein. But what's really interesting is that, so you've got like your government agents, your FBI agents, your G-men, you've got police officers, you have reporters, you have private investigators, and you could also decide to pick a career in crime and be a gangster, or be an independent criminal, or be part of like a gang, or like part of an organized crime syndicate. So there's different types of criminals that you can be. Now, what's really interesting is that this game has asymmetric gameplay, meaning that you can have players playing sort of on opposite sides. So it tells you right in the upfront, in the introduction, that you might have a player who decides to be, like a government agent or an FBI agent, and then someone else is a reporter and someone else is a private investigator. And it says one of your other players might decide to be a criminal. And so then it says like, and then if the criminal commits a crime, like the government agent or if there's a police officer, like they might try to go after that person and figure out like how they committed the crime. So it's really interesting that it's kind of very, and it's very like evocative of that sort of like player versus player kind of thing that we saw in early D&D that we've talked about recently here on the channel, and where you have players like working actively against each other, which I think is really kind of interesting. And there's this is a good game again to kind of show you how you can make that work without it devolving into just everyone's trying to kill each other all the time. So another thing this game has, you might have seen it just here, it has luck checks. So this is a very early game. Again, this is 1982 with this idea of making luck checks. And it tells you there are things that you can do. Like if the character's mortally wounded in a gunfight, you can make a successful luck check, and then you'd only take 1 wound. Or if you're mortally wounded in a car crash, you can you can take a successful luck check, and then you would only take 1/2 of your normal injuries. And if you're mortally wounded by a fall, you just do 1 more wound point will kill the character. So like if you make your luck check, so like you just barely scrape by. So again, these are ideas that it's adding into this kind of like narrative and story gaming element. And this is a very early example of it. That people are so used to these kinds of things now, but these things didn't really, it's not that they didn't exist. They just weren't very common back in the early days of the hobby. Now, as far as going back to the careers really quick, one of the interesting things here is that every career has different XP triggers. So they're earning experience points based on different things. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a second here and get into some more details. Now, skills in the game are also tied to careers. So there's different skill lists based on the kind of career that you're going to take. So, if you like auto theft, for example, or photography or shadowing, all these different things fall into like different groups, different groupings, whether it's criminal or, federal agent or reporting or investigation, or whether it's like a generic kind of general skill. Okay, so they kind of break it up that way. And you've got like these sandbox mechanics for figuring out like city wards and rackets and investigations and political corruption and media sway from the newspaper reports, like all this kind of stuff. And there's like actual things in here for helping you figure out how to make those work. And then you've got all these different subsystems for bribery and corruption, where you can bribe cops or judges or politicians. You have downtime activities for running businesses and building cases and gathering intelligence. And then you have random events that can be triggered by luck rolls, as an example, like ambushes or informants flipping or political scandals, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so Combat in here is pretty fast and furious. It uses a percentile dice system for hit chances. Damage is tracked using hit points. But combat is deadlier. It's much deadlier and I would say more grounded maybe than it is in D&D. It's fast and deadly. There's no hit location charts, but cover and range and weapon type matter in combat. And initiative is determined by your agility. And then to hit, you're just going to make an accuracy check plus your weapon modifier. And then damage is going to be fixed or variable depending on the kind of weapon that you're using. But most guns are going to kill you in 1 to 2 hits. So compared to D&D, D&D is using like abstract hit points. We've talked about that in armor class. Gangbusters kind of treats it more as a tactical simulation. So almost very similar to, like, say, Boot Hill. I mean, the system's different, but the thematic of it is the same. I would say cover and positioning and that kind of thing matter more than just like your raw stats, as an example. So I was talking about those XP triggers for like your different types of careers. So a federal agent might get an XP for arrests and convictions, where a gangster would get it for running rackets, obviously. A reporter would get it for publishing scoops, and then a private eye would get it for solving cases. So those are examples of how you can earn XP based on very specific things for your career. So why it's unique, I would say, is, again, we talked about that asymmetric play. Players can be allies or they can be enemies in the same group of the same party that's playing at the same time. You have this emergent narrative that's coming based on player actions. And, it's just, unlike a lot of the other games, I would say, similar to Dawn Patrol, however, it's putting realism over abstraction. So you don't have all of the monsters, the magic, all that kind of stuff. It's just, very much based on like a more historical. I would say, unlike Dawn Patrol, Gangbusters is a little bit more gamified in a way. I guess it's not tactical. It's not a tactical war game like Dawn Patrol was, but some ideas I think that you can take from this and put into an OSR style game or a D&D game. And I'm doing that because I think most of my viewers are into D&D or playing other sort of early fantasy class and level type games. And so that's why I'm talking about this. And I'm trying to show that you can get inspiration from anywhere. This is a game about 1920s crime and bootlegging and stuff like that. But there's still mechanics out of this that we can take, separate from the genre, and figure out how to twist it and put it into a D&D game if it's something that we think we might want to use. So obviously the presence or the reputation score, people have dabbled with these over the years, but this is a very clean and easy system. You just roll a d10 and then you figure out what your bonus is. And in a D&D game, you could leave it at that and just figure that that is a bonus to your reaction roll in addition to whatever your charisma is, or in replacement of your charisma, however you want to do it, right? But then what you're doing is you're making it a living system by giving the player opportunities to get that number, that presence to go up or down based on their actions. So, if they're slaying a monster publicly, like a dragon or something that's bothering a town, you would add to your presence. And if you lose face for whatever reason it may be, then you would lose presence, right? And so the number's going to change all the time after you've rolled that initial D10 to kind of figure out where you're going to start. But it creates a living reputation system that can kind of evolve with the campaign, which I think is really fun. Now, for career-specific XP triggers, it was XP that was awarded for job-related activities. So I talked about this: gangsters for rackets, reporters for scoops, etc. Well, that's something you can easily do in a D&D game. So you can start to create XP triggers for specific classes. So fighters would gain it for battlefield victories. Obviously, that makes more sense. You're not saying the other characters aren't. Maybe fighters just get more, right? Because it's like that's what they're supposed to do. But thieves could get it for a successful heist, or clerics could get it for spreading the faith or building a temple, like whatever it is, right? So you could create these kinds of XP rewards for the different classes based on, to encourage the players to role play and to take those chances to do those kinds of things. And it wouldn't have to replace the existing XP system. It could just be a bonus. It could be added on, or you could use it to replace. If you don't like tracking XP for gold, you could create these very specific systems to track in D&D, and it could work. You just have to look out for any pitfalls and see if you're giving away too much or too little, and then kind of adjust from there. But it reinforces sort of the class-based fantasy style, and it helps diversify the motivations so that every character doesn't just have to be motivated by gold to raise in level, to increase their level. You could have different classes motivated by different things, and that helps with the role play. And then the urban sandbox kind of faction play, I think this is a really fascinating one. So in Gangbusters, Lakefront City is divided into different wards that each have competing factions, and control shifts in those factions during play of the game. So for a D&D adaptation, you could totally do this in a city. Just break your city down into different districts with different faction scores. And then you would rate that on a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 10 type of basis. And so, your different factions, like your Thieves Guild or your City Watch or, your Temple District, like all these different things. And they could all have like a different score, a different faction score. And then depending on what's going to happen over time, it's going to affect that faction score. So it's sort of like you're tracking it like a wilderness hex crawl as you move through the city, but you're keeping track of all these faction points or faction scores, whatever you want to call them, that are going to be affected by things like bribes or raids or diplomacy or whatever it is. It's going to cause those scores to go up and down. So there's more to it in the Gangbusters game. I'm just giving you a flavor of things that you could get out of a game like this and adapt to a D&D style game. And then as far as like trials and corruption, that's another really fun one in Gangbusters. So when criminals go to trial, their presence affects what's going to happen to them, but also if they attempt to bribe any allies that are going to help them. And so corruption is sort of a built-in system to this game to sort of evoke that historical period of time in the United States, right? And so, well, you could do that in a D&D game. Like Trials, I think, is a really underutilized concept. If you've, got a bunch of murder hobos going through town, like at some point they should come across a city watch, and there should be enough of them that they're a threat that the characters don't think they're going to mow through them. And they should maybe have to answer for what they're doing once in a while for just randomly murdering people all the time and stealing their stuff. So you could run a trial as sort of like a mini game within a game with evidence versus defense roles modified by bribes or their presence, that reputation we are talking about earlier, or witnesses, all that kind of stuff. And again, you're going to track your NPC corruption score, which would probably be based on a rule of like 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, something like that. And so the higher corruption for that character, the easier they are to sway, right, with a bribe or things like that. So you kind of figure out how all these numbers tie together, but they're really kind of fun ways to kind of give a little bit of teeth to the Law and Order. I think so many people ignore that. So many players and game masters both ignore the fact that these cities couldn't operate the way that they seem to, with just random parties of adventurers armed to the hilt, walking through the city, taking what they want and killing people that get in their way, and have some dramatic consequences for those types of actions. Don't just make it arbitrary, but it's something that you have to do from the beginning so players know that that's something that they might have to deal with. But those are some ideas that you can get from a Gangbusters game. And let's continue our discussion now with the Indiana Jones role-playing game from 1984. So this is now getting kind of late in the period of TSR where a lot of people, this game probably just flew right by them. They weren't aware, despite the property being as popular as it was when this game came out. That at the point in 1984, there had been only 2 Indiana Jones movies. So the third, I want to say third and final, but I guess that's another discussion for another day. But this is 1984, and it is going to be one of 2 licensed properties that TSR is going to turn into a role-playing game in 84. The other one we already talked about was Marvel Superheroes. So this one is designed by Zeb Cook, Dave Zeb Cook. We've talked about him before many, many times here on the channel. And so you see the map here, and then really quickly we're going to see our credits. So Dave Cook. And so just a few other people I want to point out here. So Larry Elmore is going to do the majority of the illustrations in this. The cover, however, is done by Richard Amsel, the classic, movie poster illustration. And so some other really kind of fun credits on this. Specifically, I want to point out John Byrne. So it's Byrne, Byrne, for folks that are listening and not watching. And this is the same John Byrne who's like the comic book writer and artist. I know there's been a lot of confusion over the years, and I've seen posts like in places like Reddit and stuff like that where people say like, no, it's not that John Byrne. It is that John Byrne. It's the same guy. And it's because he's getting credit, not for game design specifically. He's getting credit for helping to create the introductory adventure that's included in the role-playing game, which is in the Indiana Jones role-playing game, which is the Icons of Icamanan. However, I don't know how to pronounce that. But because that adventure that's included in here is using ideas from a comic book for Indiana Jones that Marvel was writing at the time, publishing at the time, and John Byrne was the writer and penciler for the first few issues that included this idea of the Icons of Icamanan. So that's why he's getting a credit in here, but it's the same guy. It's the comic book guy. All right. So that's just really quick on the credits. I just wanted to point that out. So it came as a box set with a 64-page rule book. It had a referee screen, had cardboard standees, which they were starting to become very popular at the time. It had some 3D train cutouts. It has a world map, and then it has this evidence file handout that was used with the introductory adventure. And we're going to talk about that in a second here. But, as far as the other history of this game, probably the most controversial thing about this particular role-playing game is that there are no character creation rules included in here. And that was something that was due to the licensing that they had done with Lucasfilm, that they couldn't create new characters for this game. So the only characters that you can play in this basic game here, not basic, but like the box set, the original version of the game, were pre-generated characters based on characters that had appeared in the movies. So that was kind of a big thing for a lot of folks, that they didn't like that. Because if you have to use a pre-generated character, why would you pick to play anyone other than Indiana Jones? I mean, I guess for role-playing reasons, maybe, but like, you're going to be Short Round or you're going to be Marion when you could be Indy. It doesn't really make a lot of sense necessarily. As far as the system, it's a very kind of streamlined cinematic type of system aiming for fast-paced action, in contrast to sort of like crunchy mechanics. So it is going to be based on the action results table that we talked about with the Marvel superhero games before. So see that specific video if you want to learn more about it. But essentially, the gist of it is that it's a percentile-based task resolution system where you're going to roll under an attribute, and then you're going to modify your roll based on difficulty. So routine means that you're going to add plus 20% to your attribute when you're rolling. Challenging means there's no modifier. If it's difficult, you're going to subtract 20%, and then if it's heroic, you're going to subtract 40%. So if your ability score was say 80% and you're trying to accomplish an heroic task with that specific ability score, that attribute, you would subtract 40%. So instead of 80, it would be 40, and then you'd have to roll 40 or under when you do your roll. And that's the extent of the task resolution system. So as far as attributes, you have things like strength, movement, prowess, backbone, instinct, appeal, and health. So it's going to talk all about that in here. And then it's going to have, again, like the cinematic design for doing things like stunts and chases and cliffhangers. That's the kind of stuff that you get out of a game like this. And that's what you'd want, right? You want it to be very cinematic. And then it uses a lot of props and handouts for immersion. That's kind of like built into the game is doing that. And then there's really not XP. You're advancing kind of through story and gear and allies. So that's where you're kind of like getting better. You're not really getting better necessarily. It's not like you're leveling like you are in a D&D game. So combat initiatives based on movement to hit, you're rolling under your prowess score, and then you're modifying that by kind of the weapon and also the situation. And then damage is going to be subtracted from your health. There's no hit locations. There's no criticals. There's nothing like that. Okay. And there's cover and terrain. It's very, very, very important. And so using these cardboard standees helps you figure out things like line of sight and movement, like how far people can move and things like that. All right. So as far as like the cinematic features, again, the handouts with the photos and the clues and the maps and all that kind of stuff, it really kind of helps you kind of like immerse yourself, like in the movie when, like, Indiana Jones picks out the book to look up the Holy Grail, or when he gets out his dad's Grail diary and is looking at all the drawings and like all that kind of stuff. That was kind of what they were trying to evoke with these different handouts. And then the adventures, they call them adventure packs instead of like modules. And so they had stuff like for the movies and things like that, but they have scripted scenes and set pieces in them. And they used a lot of like 3D terrain cutouts, like I was talking about before with those cardboard standees and things like that. So the basic game, again, has no formal XP or leveling or anything like that. So you don't advance numerically, but you are encouraged to keep track of things like your successful missions, any recovered artifacts, and any defeated villains that have happened during the adventure. So, and then it says that the referee, the judge, can award bonuses or narrative promotions, as an example. So by gaining new gear or new allies, things like that. All right. So as far as why it's unique, again, it's one of these licensed IP games from TSR. It is one of the first RPGs based on a major film franchise. Not the first, but it is one of the first. And it has this kind of very cinematic design to it, emphasizing story beats, set pieces, visual aids, that kind of thing. Very different than like a standard Dungeons and Dragons style game. And it has, again, a hybrid format. So it's matching board game elements like these cutouts and these maps and like the buildings and all that kind of stuff, but with role-playing game aspects to it, okay? But it definitely has its limitations. So there is no character creation in here at all, like I talked about. So the creators of the game are going to get around this restriction where Lucasfilm said you can't have character creation rules by creating one of their survival packs that they, the judges' survival pack. And it's going to have rules in there for how to make non-player characters. And somehow they were able to get around this idea. It was like, well, we need NPCs for these characters to fight or to interact with. And so we need to have rules on how to create those. But that was a way of getting around it, because really most people were going to use those to make their own characters. So I think most people kind of figured that out. It does have sort of limited replayability unless you're going to just create your own adventures. But if you're going to be just based on something from the movies, which is what most of the adventures were like, it is kind of hard to like continue a long-term campaign. And the adventures, I talked about the scripted scenes, but they lead really heavily into these like overly scripted scenes. And a lot of people just don't like that kind of stuff. So this game didn't do well. It has a pretty bad reputation. It didn't get reviewed well. It sold very, very poorly, which, is too bad. It was a surprise because, they spent a lot of money on this license. I mean, you can imagine that wasn't going to be, cheap to get this license back in the day. The films were very, very popular. And so spending all that money and then having this game not do well, partly because of the design limitations that they had to work within, like the no character creation and things like that, the game kind of just like passed people by. So by the time they do get to the character creation rules, people just kind of moved on, didn't care anymore. And so TSR was actually forced to destroy like thousands, it might have even been tens of thousands of printed copies of this game that didn't sell. And it really affected them financially. And they were already in financial problems. So if you have watched my videos before, you know that 1984 is going to be kind of a crucial year, because 1985 is when Gary Gygax is going to come back from the West Coast from running the D&D Entertainment Group. That was trying to get a movie made, ended up making the D&D cartoon. And, Gary claims that he had no idea TSR was in this financial situation, but he's going to try to, quote unquote, right the ship. And they published 2 AD&D hardbacks that year as a way to try to make money and try to get things back on track financially. So they were in a desperate situation, and they couldn't afford to have paid all the money for this license to then have the game not sell, to then having to destroy copies that they were never going to be able to sell. That was a big, huge blow to them. Okay. But as far as like some of the things that we can take away from this game to try to apply or inspire us in our OSR style D&D games. Well, there is a unified resolution system. So this is going to be a controversial topic for a lot of folks because, that's the D20 system, right? Getting rid of all of these different subsystems, like different rules for thief abilities versus 1 in 6 checks versus percentile checks versus 2d6 turn undead versus all of that. So all of these sort of action result table, whether it's Marvel or whether it's this game, Indiana Jones, or whether it's later era Gamma World, or whether it's the Conan role-playing game we're going to talk about, they use that unified mechanic. And that is something that a lot of people prefer. And this is a way that you can be inspired by some of these ideas to figure out how to implement that in a D&D style game if that's something that you want. Some of the other ideas that I think are even better or more applicable are these set piece encounters. So the designed adventures for the Indiana Jones role-playing game they're designed around these like big cinematic movements, like collapsing rope bridges or runaway boulders, things like that you've seen in the movies. And that is something you can very easily apply in D&D. I think too many people forget how important the environment should be and how to explain it narratively to make it an important part and to help immerse players in what's going on around them. Treating dungeon rooms as like these cinematic scenes, designing mechanics around environmental hazards, bridge collapsing after so many rounds, lava rising so many feet per turn, this kind of thing. And then characters trying to figure out a way to get out of that. So if you've watched my GM advice sort of campaign prep video series, I talk about a lot of that kind of stuff in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, like, running across bridges and chase scenes and things like that. But also the props. So it's another thing you can be inspired by is the maps, the evidence files, all the 3D cutouts, and including stuff like that in games. So again, I have my job board that I just showed in a recent video. But you can go beyond that. You can always have notes to pass out to players and like, don't just scribble it on like an index card. You can spend a little bit of time and print it out in a fun font on some cool, parchment style paper that you can buy at your office supply store to make it seem more like an in-world item and help kind of ground your players and immerse them in what's happening. Handing clues to players instead of just narrating them really helps kind of with that sort of cinematic feel that you want from game like this. And then villain design. So there's a lot of ideas that you can get from a role-playing game like Indiana Jones for how to handle villains. And you want it to be a little bit happy because, not happy. You want it to be a little bit careful with using rules like this because it can start to feel like it's just DM fiat and that really story-based stuff that like happened in Dragonlance that a lot of people don't like. But in the Indiana Jones game, you have villains sort of escalating across several acts during an adventure. So they have an entrance, there's like a rivalry with the player characters, and then there's like a final showdown. So it's not just like the villains there and then the player characters kill them. It's sort of like it's being drawn out through a series of scenes. And so having a recurring villain is a really fun thing for a D&D game. And I think it's something that people should use a little bit more often. And you can have them, be prepared when you introduce a villain that you want to have be a recurring villain. Make sure that there's an escape plan so it doesn't seem false when the player characters think that they've killed him and then he shows up later and they're like, haha, you didn't actually kill me. I was just, asleep or whatever. Like, no, have them actually escape and have the player characters see them escape. And maybe you do role play through the chase scene, but the villain should have systems in place to ensure their getaway without it seeming like it's forced. It should be through clever planning. Okay, but it helps create narrative arcs without railroading. That's what you're trying to do. You don't want to railroad. And so you can get ideas like that from a game like Indiana Jones role-playing game. Okay, now we're going to go to 1985 and discuss the Conan role-playing game. I want to do a little bit of history, though, as far as how Conan is involved in Dungeons & Dragons and TSR history. And also just as a reminder, I wasn't trying to do like a full deep dive. So I know in a lot of these games, I'm skipping over entire parts of the mechanics and things like that. Because my point was to, again, not to teach you how to play this game or show all of its mechanics. I was trying to show you a little bit about what makes it unique and how, again, you can be inspired by some of the mechanics to use them in other styles of games, such as Dungeons & Dragons. If you have questions about the mechanics as well, you can go ahead and leave that in the show notes below, or in the comments below, I should say. All right, but let's look at what TSR's sort of involvement with Conan. And, Conan is listed in the Appendix N. Robert E. Howard is an author, and we know that Gary Gygax read very, very liberally from the Conan works. But we first see it show up as far as an official D&D kind of capacity is going to be here in this book. This is Gods, Demigods, and Heroes by Rob Kuntz and Jim Ward. I think Jim Ward did most of the work on this, although I could be wrong, but he's sort of known as like the gods person for D&D because he also wrote Deities and Demigods for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This is from 1976, and they include this section here on Robert E. Howard's Hyboria. And it says, no, this myth has no psionic abilities. And so then he goes on and talks about, basically gives you stats for Conan, Crom, Mitra, Set, Asura. I can't pronounce all these names. Sophagus, Hanuman the Accursed, Yezud, Bloodstained God, Yama, and the Priest King of Set, Thothamon, Thothamon's Ring, Khitan Assassins, the Black Seers, Epemstrius the Sage, a Pictish Shaman, Priest of the Golden Peacock, Giant Slug, Demon of the Black Hands, Mountain. So there's a lot of really fun ideas in here. Got Red Shadows, and that kind of thing. So there's lots of ideas. Now, I believe this is another case where TSR just put these in here and didn't really ask permission or have a license. I don't believe there's any licensing agreement or anything in here about that. So it would make sense then why those weren't included in Deities and Demigods when that came out in 1980. So I've talked all about that book before there. And again, there's a lot of misinformation in there or out there about why Cthulhu and Melniboné were in there. And people will say, oh, TSR did it again. They abuse these copyright. And that is exactly not what happened at all. So there's a whole story about it. Just watch that other video to understand. But Jim Ward did have the clearance from people to put those in there. And it just didn't work out. So anyway, TSR publishes that. And then years later, they're going to publish these two adventures in 1984. So this is the year before the Conan role-playing game comes out. And these are based on the movies. So CB1 is Conan Unchained. It's CB stands for Conan the Barbarian. So Conan Unchained and then Conan Against Darkness. And you see the cover photos here. These are some of the only adventure modules for TSR, for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons or Dungeons & Dragons that feature photographs instead of drawings. They might be the only ones. But some really kind of fun stuff in here. Here's your characters. You've got Conan, you've got Valeria of the Red Brotherhood, Juma the Warrior, and Nestor the Gunderman. And these are adventure modules, but they're for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and they make some exceptions. They talk about it here, where Conan has abilities that normal characters probably wouldn't have, in order to fit in his abilities within the AD&D framework. But these are written for AD&D, and they obviously had a license. So you can tell they've licensed these from, I'm guessing the movie production company. I'm not sure where the license would have come from, but that's what we've seen up until this point as far as official Conan stuff. They're also going to do a Red Sonja module, which I don't own, for Advanced D&D. But then all this is going to kind of culminate in producing the Conan role-playing game 1985. Okay, let's continue our discussion of the 1985 Conan role-playing game by TSR with this striking cover here by artist Jeff Butler, who is very well known for his comic book style art, which makes sense because Jeff Butler is also a comic book artist. And we see, going to the next page, that the interior illustrations are going to be by Jeff Easley, and then this game design is by Dave Cook. So, reminder, Dave's nickname is Zeb, and that's going to be important in just a second here. But this game came out in 1985, and it is a licensed role-playing game. So there's some kind of unique stuff in here. So it was a box set. It came with a 32-page rule booklet, which I think just that alone starting out is just an interesting thing to mention, how this is an entire game system being presented in 32 pages for context, the entire game book for the basic D&D game was 64 pages. And even that, I think, is very slim by today's standards. So this being 32 pages is pretty impressive. There's also a 16-page reference booklet. There's going to be a 48-page sort of overview of the world of Conan, Hyboria. And then there's going to be some standees and cutouts and maps. It's very typical of the standard box releases that you saw from TSR during this era. So the mechanics are going to be very much based on that kind of very similar, I should say, to that action control table that we've talked about in the past. And one of the things that I think is really kind of fun about this is that people in more recent days have sort of taken this game and they have stripped out the IP, the Conan IP, and they've labeled it as Zephyrs, which stands for Zeb's Fantasy Role-Playing System, ZEFRS. And so it's like a retro clone, but it's not a D&D based retro clone. And you can find it online, ZEFRS, like I said. And it's basically a lightweight sort of skill talent pool system. So to create your character, you're going to start out by naming your character, which I think is really kind of fun. You're going to pick a birthplace, their country that they're from, and then you're going to name their parents. So this is kind of really interesting. It says you can choose any non-magical talent after you've named your parents. Okay, so you give them names and you select an occupation for your father, and then you can choose any non-magical talent for that occupation. And so that choice is going to affect your talents. So you're going to be, you're going to name your character and then you're going to be son of so-and-so or daughter of so-and-so. And so it talks a little bit all about like the talents that are available to different types of people and that kind of thing. And then it says like for talents, so this is going to be how you define your character and what your character is good at doing. So once you've chosen your background and your parents and what their sort of background is, you're going to start with 35 points to spend on talents. And you can't put more than 5 in any single talent. And you have to have at least 1 talent from each talent pool. So it's going to get all to this in a second. And then you can increase the number of points by picking a weakness. So if you pick a weakness, you get 5 extra points, but then a weakness might mean that you have restricted talents that you can't take. So as an example, if you pick fear of animals, you can't pick animal handling as a talent. Or if you pick fear of heights, you can't pick climbing as a talent. Okay, so those are the kind of things. And then it says when you're done, your character's folio will look very much like the one completed for Conan. And so they give you an example here, initial character talents, which are prowess, and under prowess is acrobatic, animal reflexes, climbing, movement, strength, swimming, and throwing. And then under fighting, which is the pool, that's fighting pool, prowess pool. Under fighting is brawling, weapon from the weapon list, and wrestling. So it talks a little bit more about talent pools over here. Talents are grouped into talent pools. So this is how you're going to define your character. So you've got prowess, which is all of your character's physical abilities other than fighting. You've got fighting, which is all different kinds of fightings. You've got endurance, which indicates how much punishment you can take. So stamina, damage endurance, and poison endurance are included there. You've got knowledge, which includes things like spells, engineering, reading, writing, language. You've got perception, which includes things like shadowing, pickpocketing, animal training. And then you've got insight, which includes natural magic, poetry, and telepathy. So the rule book describes the broad talent pools, like I just went over, and then the individual talents beneath them. So resolution's going to use percentile checks, and it's very much like going to use that universal chart from the action control table. Very, very similar to Marvel and Indiana Jones. What this one's going to do is it's going to increase the different types of tasks from routine, challenging, difficult, and heroic. It's going to add an additional layer, which is legendary. And so with the legendary task, you're going to subtract 60 percentage points from your associated attribute when you make your check. So that's kind of about it for like the system. I mean, it's a very simple system, as you can see, and it's designed that way. It's designed to be fast, cinematic. Characters, advancement is, a little bit different. It's tied to acquiring new talents and story rewards rather than kind of like the straightforward D&D leveling and experience points. So as far as combat, There's a sort of action economy that you're going to deal with here. So it's going to talk all about like the types of combat, how to hit, all of this kind of thing, who goes first. But it's very, very cinematic in a way. Talks about getting hurt, adding bonuses from weapons, strength, armor, and shields, which actually protect your character by reducing the damage received. It's not like a standard AD&D kind of armor class situation. But it's going to use that universal table for combat for hit and degree of success. So it has this whole system in here of dangers and perils like falling, fire, drowning, and poison, which is kind of fun. Again, it's very aligned with the source material with the books. And then magic is really fun. So basically magic, it mentions that it's very, very rare, and that magicians, sorcerers, wizards, and shamans are like rare and all throughout Hyboria. And then it says like, but if you do learn it, like you're going to pay a price. So you're going to have to study for long periods of time in darkened chambers and doing a lot of grim reading while your fellow adventurers are out, traveling and adventuring and doing all that kind of stuff. But the main things that's going to happen here when you learn magic is that you're going to gain a talent called obsession. So this isn't something that like you can take on your own. It's something that you gain automatically from learning magic. And it says when a character earns his first magical talent, he also automatically receives the obsession talent recorded under his insight talent pool. Has a beginning rating of 1, and whenever the character gains a new magical talent or spell, his obsession rating increases by 1. And every time the character uses certain magical items, your obsession rating increases by 1 or more points. The exact amounts listed under each item. So it affects you because it makes you desire more magical power no matter what the cost is. So anytime the character is going to be faced with the temptation to learn more magic, you have to make an obsession check. And if you fail, then it says like the character's going to do something that the player might not want them to do, which is acquire that new magical knowledge at any cost possible, right? So the character is not allowed to ignore this obsession rating. So it says you can't choose it as a character, and you can't increase it by adding more points to it, like that kind of thing. And then there's special costs, and it says magic is not without its special risks and costs. Payment can't be money or gems. It's always something more personal. This is the price one pays for magical power, and it cannot be avoided. Each talent description indicates any special cost for learning the talent. If there's a cost, choose one of the weaknesses listed below and apply it to your character immediately. So the weaknesses that they give you are animal aversion, disfigurement, distrusted, endurance loss, madness, and nocturnal. Obviously, I think to me that's just a starting point. You should be able to build on that, but those are the ones that they list here. And then it talks about the types of magic that exists and magical talent ratings, all that kind of thing. So you can see the rules here are pretty light. It talks about living in Hyboria, like money and expenses, things like that, creating Hyborian adventures. And our rule book's basically almost done at this point. So then we're going to have some tables here with the resolution table. And then you've got your reference guide. This is going to have things like random hit locations, combat modifiers, resolution tables, equipment lists, specific wound charts, which is fun. So you can see a list of talents here as well. So it talks about like blacksmith, brawling, danger sense, endurance loss, fear of magic could be a weakness. Okay, but you've got your tables here, random hit location table and monster combat modifiers chart, excuse me. So like for giving you things like if you're attacking a character from behind, or if you're blind or bound, all those types of things. You've got your equipment list, your jewelry table, and your principal Hyborian languages. And then you've got your specific wound chart. So it tells you like area hit, head, chest, gut, armor, leg, and then what happens if you're brawling, or what happens if you're doing any other kind of combat. So your whole list of talents here, and then you've got your character folio. So this just gives you an example of what a character might look like. So that they actually use Conan here. And it says Conan, the son of a blacksmith and Brythunian woman, was born in the land of Cimmeria. So it's very much like I've heard people say that it's like Mad Libs style, where you're filling in these words to kind of describe your character. So character name, and then your sex, and then your father is what your father did, and then your mother, what your mother did, and then your homeland, and then your character name again, and your appearance. So a tall, dark-haired, and muscular. And then it says, as a youth, character name, Conan learned talent, the art of blacksmithing. And then this person keeps writing, from his father and the ways of hunting and war from his savage kinfolk. Honed by his harsh life, Conan set out to discover the civilized world. So this is giving you like a background that, you know, a lot of people talk about with role-playing games now, but it's very, very short. You can see they don't give you a lot of room. And then you've got your talent pools. So prowess, fighting, endurance, knowledge. And then his perception is 0. And then his, was it intellect? I forget. Intuition, whatever that was. So then you've got your master reference sheet and everything like that. And then you get into this detailed look at the world of Hyboria. So this is the longest part of the book. This thing is 48 pages and talks all about the different societies and cultures and everything like that. And then you've got your map, which looks like it would have been really cool. This is I would have wanted this just for this map. This looks amazing. And then that's your back cover. So as far as like things that you can take from this, well, first off, why is it unique? Why is this system unique? Well, it emphasizes light kind of pulp sword and sorcery play style. And it's got this very flexible talent purchase things. It's got the universal table lookup resolution that helps you like match that brisk, fast tone of the Conan story. So it's taking that action results table from Marvel, but tweaking it just a little bit to like evoke the Conan sort of genre. Okay, so I think, you know, as far as the one thing that you could kind of take from it, you could take a lot from this, right? But I think one thing that you can take from it is this idea of like the cost of magic, the consequences. So if you want your sorcerer to be dangerous, which I really like, I like that in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, well, you can just kind of add this sort of corruption or obligation or obsession, whatever you want to call it, sort of mechanic. So you could do it as an example that each time you learn a new or a forbidden spell, you incur a point of obsession. And then once you reach X number of obsession points, there's going to be a mechanical cost, which could be -1 to your reaction roll tables, like when you're interacting socially with people. It could be an occasional compulsion that you would role play. It could be whatever, right? So in those cases, I like to work with the player and figure out like, what do you think would happen to your character, and just make sure that they're not trying to, you know, push it under the carpet, but like, you know, you've got to make it something that's going to have an impact in the game. But it creates this feel of having like costly magic. But, you know, like I know DCC, like Dungeon Crawl Classics, has some really cool mechanics that I do really like for like magical corruption and madness and all this kind of thing. Sometimes those things get just a little too fiddly. And I always struggle with that. I don't like having these really complex systems because they slow down gameplay, but something that's a little bit more role play based that maybe has like a mechanical penalty, but like you're not constantly rolling on tables, although rolling on tables can be fun too. You know, I like random tables. So that's just an idea of something that you could kind of take from the Conan role playing game. So this is kind of an interesting one. This is going to be our last game that we're going to look at today. And this is Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. So they use, you see here, XXVc. So they're using Roman numerals. And this came out in 1988. It is one of the last role-playing games that's going to be published. I'm not saying the only, I'm saying it's one of the last that's going to be published by TSR. That's not, you know, D&D related, before the takeover by Wizards of the Coast in 1997. So, this is another one that I never owned, and at the time I really had no interest in this, but it's a really interesting kind of point in history. Now, this is post Gary Gygax having been forced out of his position at TSR. And so we see a change here and a lot of different things that are going to happen with this game. And we're going to talk about that as we go through it. So first off, it's just, it was a box set. And this is published right in the second edition AD&D era. So it comes out in 1990. I guess it really was. I said 1988, but I think it's 1990. You can see that down here. Okay, and it talks about under license from the Dilly family, and we'll talk about that as well, the Dilly Family Trust. But these are all like the tables and things that would have been in the book or in the box set. I'm going to skip past that, just kind of get into like the meat of the rules here. And first off, looking at our credits. So this is going to be designed by Mike Pondsmith. Again, we've talked about Mike before here on the channel, with development by Kim Mohan, very famous for being the editor. of Dragon Magazine for a very long period of time. And then you see design consultants here. There's our friend John Pickens, but also James Ward, who very famous, created Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World, and also worked on Deities and Demigods, as I mentioned before, and tons of other stuff. And then Scott Herring, we've talked about Scott here before on the channel, and then Flint Dilley. So the short version of this is that Gary met Flint when Gary came to California to head up the TSR Entertainment Division, later called D&D Entertainment, with the express purpose of putting together a Dungeons & Dragons movie. So that movie never happened during Gary's tenure. However, the D&D cartoon on CBS is one of the things that came out of Gary working out here in California. Well, while he's out here, he's going to meet Flint Dilley. Flint Dilley comes from a family, and I'm not going to list all of his credits here, but comes from a family that basically owned the rights to, because their, grandfather, I forget who it was, someone in the family had created Buck Rogers. So they had money from residuals and things like that, and they owned the licensing to all of that. Okay, so that's why you saw the Dilley Family Trust as being the people that they paid. This game was done under license. Now, the big thing with Flint Dilley that's going to have a major impact on Dungeons & Dragons and Gary Gygax's life is that Flint introduces Gary to, I want to say it was his sister-in-law, that introduces Gary to Lorraine Williams, who's part of the Dilley family, right? So she's part of this family. And so, Lorraine Williams is Flint Dilley's sister, not sister-in-law. So Williams is her married name. She is part of the Dilley family. And so Flint introduces Gary to Lorraine and basically says, like, Lorraine can help. She's a good business person and she can help get TSR back on its feet, because TSR was struggling with, they owed money to banks and all their creditors and all this kind of stuff. And because they were not business people, they were gamers who were running a business, and that's not an easy thing to do. And Lorraine was a business person. And so Flint introduced them, and Gary liked her enough to basically say, Lorraine is sort of my second in command. So she speaks for me while I'm in California. She's kind of the person in charge calling the shots. Okay. So, well, we all know what's going to happen is that Lorraine is eventually going to, and it's not like she set out to do this. So, a lot of stories get told about her that vilify her. And, she did a lot of things that maybe weren't necessarily great. But she's not like the mustache twirling villain that a lot of people have made her out to be. So, like everyone else, she's a person and she had flaws. So did Gary. So did Dave. So do I. So do you. So whatever. But she is going to put herself in a position to force Gary out of the company, like get controlling interest in TSR. So that's kind of an interesting point. But so at this point, we've talked about that here on the channel before, which is why I'm not going to delve too much further into it. But she ends up taking control of TSR. Gary is gone. And so she starts to make a lot of decisions, one of which is that they should make a role-playing game using the rights that she owns, the intellectual property that she owns as part of the Dilley family with Buck Rogers. So they don't have to pay as much for this, if anything, but they're going to see dividends returned, or, like they're not dividends, but like they're going to see a benefit if this game sells really, really well, because, she owns the rights. Okay. So that's the short version. I probably didn't explain that very well, but again, we have talked about this on the show before, or on the channel before. And as I always say, for me, the point where I really understood, I had read all this before. I had kind of, absorbed most of it and kind of understood, but when I didn't quite grasp the full picture of what was happening, but listening to that podcast, When We Were Wizards, especially what led up to the board meeting where Gary is essentially blindsided. He shouldn't have been, but he was, and forced out of the company that he helped found, and then loses the rights to everything that he created while he was there. And it really gives you a picture of like who these people were and involved and that kind of thing. So I highly recommend listening to that, especially that board meeting, because they hire voice actors to read the minutes of that board meeting in the voice of the person like they were actually there. And it was to me, it was very chilling. I'll just put it that way. So anyway, this is a box set published during that era. So it's got rule books and setting books and maps and modular supplements and all that kind of stuff and on and on. So speaking of the supplements, just to give you a picture here, the Indiana Jones role-playing game, I think, had 2 supplements before they killed the line. It was only around for like a year, maybe a year and a half, and then they pulped everything. No, pulp sounds like a pun because it was a pulp era thing, but they had to destroy all the copies, right? The Conan role-playing game, I think had 3 adventures published for it, and then it just kind of goes away. So they pay all these money for these licenses, and then those games just go nowhere. So now we're here with the Buck Rogers game, which one could argue was a less popular license versus Conan the Barbarian and Indiana Jones, but they went full court press with this. It was a multimedia type of situation where it was going to have, books and board games and video games and all this kind of stuff, all related to this property. And I probably think you can kind of see where this is going. All right. But it's built on the AD&D, Advanced D&D second edition rules kind of engine, rules chassis. But then it adds science fiction modifications, right? So that only makes sense. So it's going to change the races that you can be, of course, Terrans, Martians, Lunarians, Venusians, and Mercurians. And then it's going to have different kind of like classes, right? So it's you've got rocket jocks and warriors and scouts and engineers and rogues and medics and that kind of thing. So, you can kind of get the sense of like it's built within that like class and level system, and they're just translating things to the genre, right? It's the same 6 ability scores that you're used to. Okay, so it uses mostly a D20 system. However, certain things are going to work on a percentage basis, which is really interesting. So, the classes and the archetypes we talked about are reflavored for sci-fi, and it follows sort of AD&D kind of levels. It's got science fiction gear. It's got faction rewards and things like that. But just looking at the table of contents here, you can see how similar it's going to be to like a D&D style game. So mechanically, there's really nothing all that different in here other than the things that they're adding on to for the trappings for a science fiction game. So skills and tech subsystems that are done on a percentage basis. You've got ship combat. You've got zero gravity combat or zero gravity, just interacting with that. You have things called jennies that you can see here under the races list. Those are genetically engineered beings. And you've got tactical hex combat appearing in certain modules for like ship to ship combat and things like that. Okay, so personal combat is going to use the AD&D rules. All right, but ship combat and tactical encounters use additional subsystems. I was just talking about that. So tactical maps, crew roles, stat ship blocks, etc. And the setting is going to emphasize sort of like crew coordination for space missions. Okay, but you can see here just like even how they outline the different ability scores is very, very similar to what we've seen. So here's our different races and our genetic engineered individuals. And then we'll get to our careers, what they call, which are just classes. So, they've got experience levels and experience points that they need and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, some other things that are in here that I think are kind of fun. You've got factions and interplanetary politics, crew role specialization. You've got cybernetics and genetic engineering and planetary hazards, like from terraforming consequences. So those are all central to the tone of the game. All right. And then, I think why this game is unique. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, right? But this is a very explicit attempt to merge AD&D, specifically AD&D second edition mechanics, with a science fiction, like a hard pulp science fiction setting. So it's not hard science fiction. It's very pulpy science fiction. Okay, so crew and ship and faction play all in a single package. And I think that was very interesting. I think that there was some kind of, interesting things that could have come out of this. Unfortunately, the game just doesn't do well. And they keep pushing it. They push it for a long time because they wanted this to do well. They put a lot of effort and time and money into this. And it's really no surprise, honestly, but it just doesn't ever take off. Okay, so by this point, the market has been flooded with science fiction games, and nobody was really clamoring for a game to play Buck Rogers in. The TV show had been off for quite a long time. That's why I remember watching the Buck Rogers TV show when I was a kid, and I thought it was cheesy as a kid. So by the time this came out, I was not interested at all. So as far as ideas that you can use from this in a D&D game, well, since this is built on a D&D engine, it's probably a little different than some of the other games we've talked about, but there is a whole section here on space combat. And again, this could be something useful if you're looking to do like aerial combat in a D&D game. And it talks about the combat procedure and the different actions and maneuvers and things that you can do, called shots, moving between decks of a ship and how that would work, crashes and collisions, which is pretty helpful stuff. It talks about things like for scientists, gadgeteering, making gadgets and inventions. These are things that you could apply for sort of like, especially like a steampunk type game. But, like I created that inventor class for my alchemy explosives and inventions supplement that I've talked about here on the channel before. And some of these things could be used in a similar way. Okay, and then it also has in the world book a section on designing your own jennies, which again, the jennies are like the genetically engineered creatures. And it basically says they're to take the place of D&D monsters because there's no creatures list in this book. But it talks about the procedure for how to sort of like make these in a game. And because, again, this is built on the D&D engine, this would be very applicable to anybody running an OSR style D&D game. But like the three basics that you're trying to figure out, and then, figuring out the environment, the genotype, the physical and cultural data, the balance, and then the game stats. And it talks about attribute scores, combat stats, saving throws, skills, and then it gives you an example and walks through how to build one of these kinds of things. So those are some ideas that you can take from the Buck Rogers in the 25th Century role-playing game. So why have these games, a lot of them, been sort of forgotten or overlooked? It's like, I don't think old timers have forgotten about Dawn Patrol, for example, but, nobody really talks about them too much these days. And I think, there's a few reasons. Obviously, these games and even other competitor games were sort of just overshadowed, I should say, by the D&D juggernaut. So D&D just became a very powerful force. And even at its lowest points, it was still continually the highest selling role-playing game almost throughout its entire history. So it is kind of hard to stop and compete. And, you also had these licensing traps. So you had like Indiana Jones and Conan costing a lot of money and then definitely not recouping it. I mean, the fact that they only produced 2 to 3 adventures for each game before scrapping the entire line after all the time and effort and money that went into creating those, that really says something about how poorly those games were selling. And also, even with, Buck Rogers, these games were just kind of costly. They were short-lived, and they failed to live up to expectations and build a community behind them. Some of the games maybe were just a little too niche. So Dawn Patrol is a really fun game, but it's kind of very narrow focus on aerial World War I combat. And so it's not really built for doing like long-term campaigns in here. Like I showed you that section at the end of the book that kind of talks about like, what happens if you go down behind enemy lines and what are some of the things that can happen. And while that is really rich for role-playing and campaign play, having an entire session or campaign arc built around getting back to where you need to be, there are really no rules in here to kind of help facilitate that. So you'd have to pull those from somewhere else if you wanted to play that style of game. The idea in here of being caught behind enemy lines is that you're getting back as quickly as possible. You're probably going to hand wave a lot of that to get back so that your pilot survived. Unless you're going to get captured, you're going to end up piloting again to go on another mission. And, a lot of this was just driven by business decisions made in a post-Gygax world, like putting money behind a Buck Rogers licensed game, and not just the role-playing game, but like the multimedia effort that was behind that none of which really kind of came to fruition. So, I do think that we lost a lot of things from, or we've forgotten a lot of things that could have a big part in current gaming. Like I'm focusing kind of on OSR style or D&D classic D&D systems, but there's these ideas could be used in a lot of different systems. But the idea of like, the presence or the reputation system in Gangbusters and the XP triggers, I think is really kind of something that's easily adaptable. The sandbox style of building the city through emergent gameplay, and then like the whole logbooks as a session report and having that add to your reputation in Dawn Patrol, and the tactical dogfights have a place in games that want to focus on that style of combat. From Indiana Jones, you've got the set piece play, the props, the examples for that kind of thing, the villains, making sure that they emerge in certain ways and have escape plans and things like that. And from Conan, I think really that spell aspect, like the obsession and the all magic has a cost kind of thing, and how that impacts your player, your sorcerer or wizard or whatever you want to call it, magic user, is a really cool idea. And then from Buck Rogers, we have ideas for adding, like, because it's built on a D&D engine already, how to add science fiction elements, how to build genetically engineered monsters, but also like adding some kind of gadgeteering, some science, and some maybe a different skill system to employ some sort of more technological skills. And like I said, maybe you're playing like a steampunk game or something like that. You don't necessarily have to be playing a science fiction game, but a lot of ideas that you could graft onto a D&D system could come from that. So those are just some of my ideas. And, I think that these games, they're not just curiosities, or at least they shouldn't be. They solve design problems, and, system matters. So a lot, I've talked about this before, but a lot of people will play or say that you can use 5e to play any kind of genre, and you can 100% do that, right? But it wasn't designed for that. And a lot of things don't necessarily work in 5e when you're trying to emulate certain mechanics, because it wasn't designed to emulate those mechanics in the first place. That wasn't part of the design principle of the game. So yeah, maybe it's easier because that system, but sometimes it makes sense to look elsewhere for things that were specifically designed with a certain goal in mind. And a lot of the things that these games that we talked about today, a lot of the problems, or not problems necessarily, but like things that come up during gameplay that these games solved, are still things that people argue about in D&D today. And I just think that's really, really interesting. So I would love to hear from you guys about what mechanic that you would use in a game. Like, would it be any of these, or maybe you have used some of these in your games, or tell me what I missed. If there was a mechanic on these that, you've used that you think is really cool, or just made the game itself, whether you used it in a D&D game or whether you used it in its original context. Was there something that I glossed over? Because, I had to move pretty fast to cover 5 different games. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on those types of mechanics that you're thinking of using. Now, I will tell you that I am toying with the idea of posting on my Patreon some of these ideas that we talked about and fleshing them out. So like the magic obsession and magic has a cost kind of thing, I'm thinking of fleshing that out into a more specific system that could be used like in a BX game, and leaving that for my patrons. So we'll see. I'm going to ask them if that's something that they would want after this video airs. So that might be a good opportunity then for you to jump on board and kind of see what I'm doing. Okay, but I would just love to hear from you in the comments below what you thought of the video and these specific games, and also share your memories if you played any of these games. So I did not have the fortune of playing any of these games back in the day. So I was aware of all of them, but I never played any of them. And I would like to hear from folks who did and what your experiences were, and which one was your favorite and that kind of thing. So share all that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You will find links to my blog, and you'll find links to all those places before that I mentioned where you can support Daddy Roll the One to help me continue making more videos like this one. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, let's do an unboxing since we have a little bit extra time here. So this comes from a fan of the channel, Scott Rubin, and Scott wrote to me and asked if he could send this to me. And I told him that I would take a look and, try to feature on the channel. I really try to support independent creators when I can, and especially if it's just kind of unique stuff that I think fits with the channel. I will say I do get a lot of notes from people, and it's very obvious that they've never watched the channel, and they're trying to make a stretch as to whether their stuff kind of really fits with the audience. Um, I've also been approached to do advertising, like do paid ads on the channel for stuff like mattresses and sleep masks. And I kind of felt like maybe that wasn't something you could sort of would be into. So I turned all those down. But this one kind of struck me. And I thought would kind of be cool. So let's take a look and see what we have here. So this is a book called Naming Your Little Geek. So before people freak out if you don't have kids or you're not planning on have kids, that's totally fine. So this is going to be a perfect resource to have for naming NPCs in your campaign. But if you are planning to have kids or whatever, or maybe you have a brother or sister or family member who's going to have kids, this could be a great gift for them because it's all about like these names from all different kinds of properties of geekdom, for comic books and Star Wars and all different fantasy books and things like that. And it kind of tells you like the history and the origins of where these names come from. So I know that because I looked it up before I opened it here. So this is my first time obviously opening the book, but like, Sinestro, that's hilarious because that's from DC Comics. And but there's Slade, Smeagol, Solomon, Obadiah. I mean, people who are fans of these kinds of things, what's going on here with all these different names. And so I just thought this is kind of fun. Like I'm honestly really looking forward to sitting down and like looking up the origins of some of these names. So look, here's Helena. So I'm assuming this is a shout out to Helena Wayne. So yeah, it says she appears in comic books, TV shows, and more. So Helena Wayne, for those of you what I'm talking about is from DC Comics. She's the Huntress. In another universe, she is the daughter of Bruce Wayne and Selena Kyle, or Catwoman. But it just talks about like the ancient Greek origins of the name. And it gets into some video games, Battlestar Galactica. It's just on and on. Like it looks very well researched. And I think they said there's like over 1,100 names, 4,400 characters, and like 1,400 different sources that they use to like back all this stuff up. So the person's name who wrote this is his name is Scott Rubin. And I just think this would be, like I said, I think it would be a great gift if you're someone like me who, when I went through the period of time when my friends were having gifts, I wanted to give them things that were very thematically like representative of who I was as a person and as their friend. And, I would always get them something off the registry that they really needed, right? So I would do that. But then I would always tack on a little something extra. So I know for a few of my friends' kids, I bought them like a little Flash, like Flash from DC Comics, like a little onesie. And one of my friends, I sent him like the ABCs of Dungeons and Dragons. And he's like, I don't know what this is. And I was like, cool, then you can learn about it while you read it to your kid. Like, and it was little things that like, when they see it, they're going to remember like, oh, I remember like so-and-so gave this to me. And, and for me, it was a way of letting them know, like, you're an important part of my life. And I want to give you something that like, I'm sharing something of mine that maybe you can share with your kid. And if your kid doesn't like it, fine. But right. But, and again, I would always make sure to get them something that they actually asked for. But I think this would be a fun little thing for someone who has announced that they have a kid. If you've got like someone in your D&D group or whatever it is, you can get it, different places online. The link that the author sent me was on Amazon. So I'll put that link here in the show notes. And, check it out. I think, like I said, I think it would be a great baby shower gift. Okay, so Naming Your Little Geek by Scott Rubin. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I'm going to move the record out of the way, although you can see what it is already. But let's dive into this drink here. So this is a beer. It's an Imperial Stout from Firestone Brewery. This goes all the way back to 2017. This is a Parabola, which is one of their famous barrel-aged Imperial Stouts. And I've had this in my wine refrigerator since 2017. That's when I bought it. So it's, what is that, like 8 years old now at this point. So these are meant to be aged You can drink them right away, of course, but they can benefit from aging. And so my wife and I used to go up to, so Firestone's up in the Central California area. They have a couple different breweries. The one I used to go to the most often was in a little town called Buellton, which is near Solvang. If you're familiar with Solvang, that's like the little Dutch town, kind of famous and touristy town, California, right in the heart of wine country, Central Coast wine country, not Napa or anything like that. But there's one in Paso Robles, which I used to go to all the time because Paso Robles has good wine that my wife and I liked. And before we had kids, we would go up here all the time to go wine tasting and beer tasting. And we would still go after my daughter was born, just, on special occasions, like a quick weekend trip if we could get my parents to watch my daughter. Of course, that was a long time ago. As you guys know, my parents both have unfortunately passed away at this point. But and then I started buying it and ordering it directly from the brewery. And so they sold out a few years ago to like a big conglomerate beer company. So I haven't really bought as much from them because I like to support like local, independent breweries. But this was back in the days when they were independent. Now, you see I have this rubber band here around the label. It's because these Parabola bottles are like infamous for the labels coming right off. So you can see that this came off in my wine fridge. And I have a few different bottles of Parabola in there, all from different vintages. And a lot of times I like to have friends over and we'll do like a vertical flight tasting of different years of Parabola. So the oldest one that I have on hand in my wine fridge is from 2012, which is the first year that I ever had it. And I think the newest one I have is from maybe 2022. But anyway, I thought I would break this out. It's one of these cases again where like I bought a bunch of these and I've been saving them for a special occasion, and I just realized I don't know why I'm saving these. And so I thought it would be fun to open it with you guys here on the channel and sample a little bit. So you can see the alcohol content here is 14.5%. So that's getting close to wine, wine levels. So this is not something where you're going to crack open this bottle and drink it like after mowing the lawn or whatever. That's not what this is intended for. So this is really more of it's a sipping thing. It's very shareable. I'm not going to be sharing this because I don't have any friends here right now at the house. And my wife, is taking it easy on drinking beer. And my daughter's not of age. So I'm just going to put a stopper in this after I open it. And, maybe I'll see some friends over the weekend. But today is September 19th. So I thought about, it's getting close to fall. So by the time you see this video, it will be fall or autumn, whatever you want to call it, of 2025. And so it's kind of that transitional period. And this is a perfect beer, I think, to kind of get you in a fall mood. So these barrel-aged imperial stouts, they have a lot of like chocolate, and you get coffee flavors, that kind of stuff from the barrel aging. So the barrels are usually bourbon. There was a label in the back here, which also came off, which got a little bit more into the details. But I've had a few of these before, but I thought I would just open this one up and share it with you. So I'm actually using a Firestone tasting glass, and these are the kind of glasses that they will give you, like if you're at the brewery and you're getting a Parabola and you're tasting it, they will give you one of these little glasses. So I bought a few of these to taste. So cheers. And thanks for watching through the bonus content. Well, that's delicious. So it's like creamy. It's very smooth. Again, that coffee is really coming through. There are some hints of chocolate. It's like some bitter, smoky kind of flavors. I know a lot of people don't enjoy beers like this, but I like to try a wide variety of beers. So this one's kind of fun, and I do like that I've had this for a long enough time that I've had like a few bottles like here and there over the years, and just seeing how it's developing and changing while it stays in my wine refrigerator. So just really quick, I will check this in later on Untappd, Untappd, which is an app that I use to track my beers that I want to try or that I have had. And so if anybody out there, I always put it in the show notes, but if anybody out there wants to follow me on Untappd just to, share your beer thoughts and whatever, go ahead and do that. And the link is in the show notes. Okay. So that's the beer or my drink. And then let's look at this album. So this is The Replacements, Hootenanny, 1983. So The Replacements, one of my favorite bands. Um, and this was a special pressing from Vinyl Me Please. Sorry if that, for those of you, I know some people like to watch the show as they're kind of trying to relax at the end of the evening. So sorry if this plastic crinkling is kind of not very pleasant right now. I apologize for that. But you've got, this is a special pressing from Vinyl Me Please. And so what that comes with the OB strip, as you can see here, that to the side. So originally, this album came out in 1983. This is a new pressing. This was from 2024. This is before Vinyl Me Please kind of just, imploded, and which sucks. But, they made a lot of bad business decisions. So, but this is on a very kind of fun blue vinyl, as you can see here. And this is their second album. This is the Replacement's second album. So the Replacement's very, very crucial in the development of kind of like that post-punk moving into like, they're sort of like almost like a transitional, like Seattle sound grunge band. And I really dig it. So they have a lot of songs that I really like. This particular album, a lot of people have said that like each track individually doesn't really stand out, but it's when you put them all together on the album that they really shine. I think that's probably a little bit harsh, but they start exploring a lot of different sounds in this particular album. So they're getting into like country and bluegrass but rock and all different kinds of stuff. And you can see all the different band members here. So I think maybe the one that people might know the best is going to be Paul Westerberg, who's on vocals and guitar. But the one song that I think you might know if you've never heard of the Replacements, which I hope that you have, because I think they're a really fundamental band to kind of explore and listen to, but it's going to be Within Your Reach. So, and the reason why you might know that song if you're my age is when the John Cusack movie Say Anything came out back in 1987, 88, I think it was maybe 88. At the end of that movie, like the very tail end of that movie, they start playing a song, and there's this really heavy, like grungy guitar riff that starts playing. And then you get a little bit of drums kind of kicking on top of it. And they never actually get into the lyrics of the song, but that guitar riff just always grabbed me. And I sought the song out, and it was this song, Within Your Reach. Now, what's interesting about that song is on this particular album, Paul Westerberg that I just talked about, he's going to do the entire song solo, like himself. He's going to play the drums, he's going to sing, he's going to play the guitar. All the instruments are going to be played by Paul Westerberg on that particular track. I think I like it just because it's like the first one I kind of heard from this album, and I heard it in a movie before I just like discovered the album. But I really encourage you to explore the Replacements catalog of songs. They have just so many good ones. There's so songs like Alex Chilton, there's Can't Hardly Wait, Kiss Me on the Bus, Skyway, Swingin' Party. These are all just like great songs. My daughter loves listening to them. Like Swingin' Party is one of her favorite songs. Like she will specifically request that I put it on in the car when I drive her to school in the morning. So definitely give it a chance. And I would love to hear what you think about that. Let me know if you've ever had Parabola, or if you like barrel-aged Imperial Stouts. Share that in the show notes below. Please, if you can, click on one of these other videos to watch one of them right after you finish this one. That really helps the channel, helps the algorithm to know that people are interested in my content. And I will talk to you next time. Cheers.